My family thought I was the lost one, the one who'd never make it. My brother Derek was the golden child, the one they celebrated every Thanksgiving. Then at dinner I told them the house Derek was about to buy belonged to one of my investments. I told them I sold my startup last year and kept $15 million. My dad dropped his fork. My mom went pale. I'm Ethan, and for 36 years I was invisible at that table until I wasn't. Thanksgiving morning always had a familiar chill in the air, the kind that clung to your skin no matter how many layers you wore. I stood in my small apartment in Aurora, Colorado, staring out the frosted window, watching the neighbors load up their kid with casseroles and pumpkin pies, smiling like they'd been waiting all year for this moment. I sipped the last of my black coffee and looked over at the navy duffel bag I'd packed last night. Just one change of clothes, just enough to show up, smile politely, and get through the day. The drive to my parents' place in Highlands Ranch took just under 40 minutes. Traffic was light. Most people were already where they needed to be. I wasn't in a hurry. I knew exactly how this day would go. The front yard would be lined with my mother's seasonal decorations, probably the same scarecrow from 5 years ago with its arm half fallen off. The house would smell like cinnamon and turkey, and every single person in that dining room would be gathered around my older brother Derek like he was some war hero returning from battle. The last time I'd been home for Thanksgiving, I spent most of the dinner reaching across the table to pass dishes, responding to questions directed at Derek, but accidentally thrown my way. No one noticed. No one ever really did. I pulled up to the curb and turned off the engine. The house looked exactly the same. White shutters, clean-cut lawn, the oversized inflatable turkey swaying a little in the wind. I took a deep breath. I wasn't here to prove anything. I had told myself that repeatedly over the past week, but something about this year felt different. I wasn't walking into that house as the same person I'd been all those years, not anymore. The door opened before I could knock. My mom stood there in her rust-orange sweater and dark jeans, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Oh, good, you made it," she said, stepping aside without a hug. Inside, the smell of rosemary and baked apples hit me like a wave. I dropped my bag by the coat rack and followed her into the kitchen. "You didn't bring anything?" she asked, glancing at my empty hands. "I brought wine. It's in the car. I'll grab it later." She nodded already, moving toward the oven. "Derek and Lily are in the den. You might want to say hi before everyone gets here." Of course he was here early. Of course Lily, his fiancée, was too. I walked through the hallway lined with school photos and family portraits, all of them perfectly staged, most of them featuring Derek front and center. Even the college graduation wall only had his frame straight. Mine had been crooked since 2012. I found them on the couch. Derek was in a navy quarter zip and jeans, one arm draped around Lily, who looked exactly like the kind of woman who made Pinterest boards for holiday decor. "Ethan," Derek said, getting up and clapping me on the back. "Man, long time. Didn't think you'd make it this year." I forced a smile. Wouldn't miss it. Lily gave a polite wave, then turned back to whatever game was playing on TV. We talked for a few minutes, mostly surface-level stuff. Traffic, weather, some vague mention of the Broncos. Derek talked about his promotion at the bank, his new house still in escrow, their honeymoon plans for the spring. Not once did he ask me about my work. I didn't offer anything either. It was like our roles had been cemented years ago and no one felt the need to question them. People started arriving around noon. Cousins, aunts, uncles, all with their signature dishes and 2 loud greetings. My dad appeared from the garage already wearing an apron, holding tongs in one hand and a glass of beer in the other. He grinned at Derek, slapped him on the back, then turned to me with a nod. "Glad you made it, son." I nodded back. "Yeah, good to see you too." We sat down around 2. The dining table was dressed to impress as usual. China plates, cloth napkins, candlesticks, lit even though it was still bright outside. My mom liked appearances. Always had. She gave a speech about family, about how proud she was of Derek and Lily, about how grateful she was for the upcoming wedding and their new beginnings. I took a sip of my wine, let the words wash over me like static. "Pass the stuffing, will you?" Derek asked, not even looking in my direction as he said it. I passed it without a word. Lily leaned in and asked him about the new mortgage rate they got approved for. Derek launched into a 10-minute monologue about interest rates and market conditions, like he was presenting to a boardroom. Someone down the table asked me what I was doing these days. Before I could answer, Derek cut in with a joke about me being some kind of crypto guy. The table laughed. I smiled politely, said nothing. But inside I felt it, that familiar pressure in my chest, the one that used to make me feel small, invisible, forgotten. Only this time it didn't hurt the same way. This time it sparked something else. I looked around that table, really looked. And I realized something. None of them knew who I was anymore. Not really. They were all still seeing the version of me they had written off years ago, and that version didn't exist anymore. I smiled, leaned back in my chair, and took another sip of wine. This year would be different. I wasn't here to win them over. I wasn't here to be seen. I was here to change everything. It used to start with Derek's birthday parties. Every year he got the newest gadgets, stacks of wrapped boxes, entire banners strung across the living room that read, "We're proud of you," or "Our future champion." He played soccer, baseball, even lacrosse. My parents showed up at every game, rain or shine, in matching t-shirts with his jersey number printed across their backs. When I turned 10, I asked if I could join a robotics club. My dad said maybe next year. That maybe never came. They weren't bad people. They just had tunnel vision when it came to Derek. He was loud, confident, the kind of kid who lit up a room. I was quieter, the kind who kept Legos sorted by color, who read finance magazines while other kids played Call of Duty. My mom thought it was quirky. My dad called it unrealistic. I learned early that talking too much about the things I liked usually led to blank stares or awkward silence at the dinner table. The only person who ever leaned in when I spoke was my grandfather, Walter. He lived in a small ranch house in Littleton, about 15 minutes away. And I visited him every weekend until he passed. He wasn't the affectionate kind. He never ruffled my hair or told me I was special. But he listened. And more than that, he treated me like I wasn't invisible. We had a ritual. Every Sunday night after my parents dropped me off, we would sit in his den with the television tuned to financial news. CNBC, Bloomberg, sometimes reruns of market specials if he recorded them. He kept yellow legal pads stacked on the end table, scribbling notes while I tried to decode ticker symbols. At first, I didn't understand most of it. But it fascinated me. The charts, the numbers, the way someone's future could change based on something as simple as timing. One evening when I was 13, I asked him what he thought was the smartest thing a person could do with $100. He didn't laugh. He didn't tell me it wasn't enough to matter. He pulled out a paperback book from his bookshelf and handed it to me. It was dog-eared and smelled faintly of tobacco. The title read, "The Intelligent Investor." I stayed up all night reading it by flashlight. When I was 14, I got my first job bagging groceries at a King Soopers on the edge of town. Most of the kids I worked with blew their paychecks on sneakers and fast food. I saved every dollar. Every Sunday I brought my paycheck stub to Grandpa Walter, and we calculated how much I could invest without dipping into what he called my emergency fund. He helped me open a custodial brokerage account under his name and showed me how to research companies. At 16, I bought my first stock. I didn't tell my parents. They thought I was spending too much time on the computer, and my mom even tried to limit my screen time. I let her believe I was gaming. It was easier that way. I didn't want to explain the feeling I got when a company I picked had a good quarter, or when I read a balance sheet and it actually made sense. I had built something that was mine, quiet, hidden, and powerful in a way I couldn't yet name. By the time I graduated high school, I had a few $1,000s in that account. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My father gave Derek a brand new Jeep for graduation. I got a suit that was too big and a handshake. He told me I needed to be realistic about my future, that not everyone got to chase hobbies and expect a paycheck. I nodded, smiled, and said thank you. That's what I always did. College was a blur. I studied finance at the University of Northern Colorado while Derek went to CU Boulder on a scholarship and joined a fraternity that held charity golf tournaments. He visited home often. My parents drove up for every midterm check-in. I called once a month. No one seemed to notice. At school, I kept to myself. I did well in my classes, but I wasn't the type to make a name for myself. I interned at a wealth management firm during the summers and worked evenings tutoring first-year students in microeconomics. Every spare dollar I made went into my portfolio. I watched it grow, slowly, patiently, like a sapling you protect from the wind. My friends spent spring break in Miami. I spent mine watching earnings calls and updating spreadsheets in the library basement. When I was 21, Walter had a mild stroke. I skipped finals to be with him in the hospital. He looked small in that bed, pale and shivering under the too thin blankets. But when he saw me, his eyes lit up. He reached for my hand and squeezed. "Keep your head down," he said. "Build quietly. When it's time, they won't see it coming." I never forgot that. After he recovered, he gave me access to one of his investment accounts. Not to use, but to observe. A living classroom. I treated it with reverence. He taught me about options diversification and the long game. Not just financially, but in life. That was his favorite phrase. Play the long game. The summer before I graduated, my parents called to say Derek had gotten a job offer in Texas. High-salary company car, the works. They threw a backyard party with banners and a custom cake. I watched the photos roll in on Facebook while eating frozen pasta alone in my off-campus apartment. I didn't feel angry. I felt removed, like I'd quietly stepped out of a movie where I was always the extra and started directing something else, something entirely mine. Back in the present, I sat in my childhood home surrounded by people who had no idea who I'd become or what I'd built. The sounds of laughter drifted in from the kitchen as my mom refilled wine glasses and bragged about Derek's upcoming wedding. I thought about Grandpa Walter's old den, the sound of the TV humming in the background, the scratch of his pen on paper. No one in that house knew I'd started investing at 16. No one knew I turned $5,000 into $15 million, but they would, soon. After graduation, I did what my father expected. I came home, tucked my degree into a drawer, and joined Whitaker & Sons Construction as a junior project coordinator. It wasn't my dream, not even close, but I told myself it was temporary. A year or two of stability, maybe gain some real-world experience, then move on to something that felt more like me. At the very least, I thought it might bring me closer to him. The office was a modest 2-story building near Centennial, not fit from the golf course, where Dad played on weekends. My cubicle sat in the far corner of the operations floor next to the copy machine that jammed at least twice a week. My first month was quiet. I filed permits, made phone calls, and stayed out of the way. I didn't mind the routine. It gave me time to think. Derek worked upstairs in management. He wore tailored suits and had his own assistant, even though we technically started at the same time. Every time he passed my desk, he'd nod, like he barely recognized me. Sometimes I wondered if he truly didn't. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between him and my father in the break room. They were discussing a high-rise development in downtown Denver, a multi-million-dollar bid the company had just secured. I leaned against the wall outside the door trying to catch details. It was the kind of project I wanted to be part of, the kind that could change the trajectory of a young professional's career. At the next staff meeting, I raised my hand. "I've been following the Liberty Towers project," I said. "I'd love a chance to contribute, even just in support. I've already read through the initial city proposals." Derek glanced at my father. My dad gave a tight smile. "That's not really in your scope right now, son. We've got more experienced people on that." I nodded, swallowed the sting, and went back to managing punch lists and supplier emails. Weeks passed. Then one morning I logged into the internal system and found that my access to certain files had been revoked. My emails about Liberty Towers bounced back. When I asked the IT guy, he shrugged and said Derek had made some department changes. I confronted Derek after hours in the parking lot. "What are you doing?" I asked. "You know I've been working toward that project." He didn't even flinch. "This isn't college, Ethan. You don't get gold stars for trying. You're not ready." I stood there in silence, the words echoing in my ears like a slap. I wanted to yell, to tell him I was more prepared than half the guys in that meeting room, that I'd been studying project finance since I was a teenager while he was out partying at CU. But I didn't, because deep down I knew he wasn't afraid I would fail. He was afraid I'd do well. I tried to explain everything to my parents that weekend. I showed them the emails, the access logs, the calendar invites I was pulled from. My mom stirred the soup and barely looked up. "I'm sure Derek had his reasons," she said. "He's always been more direct than you." My father's jaw tightened. "You have to earn your place, Ethan. We don't hand things out just because you're family." I stared at them, feeling something inside me split. It wasn't just disappointment. It was betrayal. Not because they took Derek's side, but because they didn't even consider mine. That night, I sat in my old bedroom staring at the ceiling fan spinning overhead. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to earn their approval. The weekends I skipped parties to study, the internships I fought for, the money I saved, and for what to be invisible in my own family's business. By morning, I had made my decision. I typed up my resignation letter, left it on my father's desk before anyone arrived, and walked out without looking back. I didn't tell them where I was going. I didn't answer their calls. I moved into a studio apartment near 5 Points, sold my used sedan, and bought a refurbished laptop. I poured everything I had into the only thing that had ever made sense to me. Numbers, markets, systems. By the fall of 20, I had registered an LLC, Solus Analytics. It started as a one-man consultancy helping small investors optimize their portfolios using algorithmic models I designed from scratch. I worked out of coffee shops and co-working spaces. I lived on instant ramen and peanut butter sandwiches. I kept my overhead low and my ambition high. Every week I'd email Walter with updates. He was the only one I trusted with the truth. He replied in short, gruff messages filled with typos. But I could tell he was proud. "Keep your edge. Don't slow down." By late 2016, I had 5 clients and a small team of contractors working remotely. I reinvested every dollar. My software improved. Word spread. We weren't flashy, but we were efficient. I didn't chase funding. I didn't make noise. I played the long game. Back at home, I assumed they thought I was just drifting. Derek probably told them I was freelancing or dabbling. Maybe they believed I was still bitter over some imagined slight. They never asked. That suited me just fine. One night, almost 2 years after I left the company, I walked past the downtown development site where Liberty Towers was nearly completed. The logo for Whitaker & Sons was lit up in the corner. I stood there for a long time, hands in my pockets, watching workers on scaffolding move like ants under floodlights. It could have been mine, but as I turned and walked away, I realized something. I was building something else. Something that was already bigger than they could imagine, and I was doing it without them. The call came early on a Thursday morning, just as the sun had started to cut through the blinds of my apartment. It was a nurse from St. Luke's. Her voice was soft, practiced, the kind that came with delivering bad news often enough that it no longer cracked. Walter had passed quietly in his sleep sometime before dawn. He had been in hospice for the last week, and I'd seen him only 2 days earlier. He had squeezed my hand and whispered something I didn't quite catch. I told myself he was saying goodbye, but the truth is I don't know. I stood in the middle of my apartment for a long time after hanging up. The coffee machine was humming, my phone buzzed with emails, but everything felt far away. I didn't cry, not then, not even when I drove to the facility or when I signed the paperwork they handed me with apologetic eyes. I sat with him for almost an hour, staring at the lines on his face, memorizing the shape of his hands, the slight smudge of ink on his left thumb. He had always written with cheap pens, always took notes on legal pads. He had a box of them in his study, stacked neatly under his desk. After the cremation, I stayed behind while the rest of the family drifted out of the chapel. Derek didn't come. My parents sent a card. They said they were busy with a work trip in Phoenix and promised to visit the grave when they got back. I didn't bother replying. The hospice nurse handed me a small manila envelope as I was leaving. She said Walter had left it for me. My name was written on the front in shaky block letters. Inside was a handwritten letter folded twice. Ethan, keep going. Don't chase them. They'll never see you until they have to. Be better anyway. Play the long game. I believe in you. Walter. It was only a few lines, but I read it until the ink started to blur from the sweat on my hands. It felt like he had reached into the moment just before the fall and pulled me back. He left me everything. It wasn't much, not in the grand scheme of things. A modest savings account, a beat-up Toyota Corolla, a few bonds, and a small rental property in Englewood that he'd owned since the 80s. The total came to around $130,000 after taxes. More than I'd ever had in my name. I used the money to incorporate Solace Analytics properly. I hired 2 full-time developers, rented a small office near Lodo, and upgraded our software infrastructure. I built out a proprietary forecasting tool and beta tested it with a handful of angel investors I'd met through quiet networking events. Word spread slowly, but it spread. By the end of 2020, we had our first 6-figure client. They were a boutique investment firm out of Chicago, looking for a smarter way to screen startups for long-term viability. Our model beat theirs in backtesting by nearly 20%. They signed a 12-month retainer within the week. I remember sitting alone in that tiny office the night the wire transfer cleared, the glow of my screen bouncing off the empty whiteboard. I stared at the confirmation email for a long time. Then I pulled Walter's letter from my wallet and read it again. I knew then that I wasn't just building a company. I was building proof. Not for Derek or my parents or anyone else who had underestimated me. For the kid I used to be. The one who sat in Walter's den, knees pulled to his chest, trying to understand ticker symbols, while the rest of the world forgot he was there. The company grew fast after that. We streamlined onboarding, brought in a business strategist, and started exploring partnerships with regional banks. Our results spoke louder than any pitch deck. In less than a year, we had tripled our client base and crossed the 1 million mark in annual recurring revenue. Still, I kept everything quiet. I didn't post on social media. I didn't attend flashy conferences. I declined interviews. I told my team that our success would be defined by performance, not noise. Every quarter I'd make a private spreadsheet titled Walter Metrics. It had nothing to do with KPIs or ROI. It tracked what I thought he would have cared about: portfolio stability, client retention, integrity. There were nights I sat at my desk past midnight exhausted, overwhelmed, but wired with momentum. I'd scroll through our dashboard watching the data flow in, feeling the pulse of what we were creating. It was real, tangible, mine. But beneath the pride was something else, a quiet grief, a sense of absence I couldn't fill. I wanted to call him, to tell him we did it, to hear his dry sarcasm and quiet approval. Instead, I settled for speaking into the air as if the walls might carry the sound to wherever he had gone. "You were right," I'd whisper. "You always were." It wasn't about revenge, not yet, not really, but it was the beginning of something bigger, something coming into focus, and soon the rest of them would have no choice but to see it too. The conference was held in a sleek hotel near downtown Denver. One of those renovated high-rises with marble floors and filtered water stations every few feet. I hadn't planned on attending. A last-minute cancellation from a colleague landed me the pass. The theme was emerging tech and real estate, which was relevant enough for Solace Analytics. We had just begun exploring data partnerships with mid-tier developers, and this felt like a good place to get a pulse on the space. I kept to the edges, listened more than I spoke, collected brochures, scanned QR codes, nodded through keynotes. It wasn't until the networking session in a crowded room buzzing with small talk and overpriced cocktails that I saw her. She stood near the back wall holding a glass of red wine, engaged in animated conversation with a group of brokers. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, styled into soft waves that framed her face. She wore a slate gray blazer, sharp and tailored. Her laugh, even over the din of the crowd, was unmistakable. Rachel Myers. It had been nearly 7 years. The last time I saw her, we were standing outside her apartment in Capitol Hill. She was crying, though she tried to hide it. I remember the exact words. "I can't keep doing this, Ethan. You're drifting. I need someone with a plan." She hadn't said it to be cruel. She was tired. We both were. I had just quit the family company. I was working 16-hour days on a startup no one believed in. She wanted security. I couldn't blame her for that, but I hadn't expected her to walk away so quickly. Now she was here, surrounded by the kind of people who used LinkedIn like a dating app, and I was standing frozen near the coffee station, unsure whether to turn around or say something. She noticed me before I made up my mind. "Ethan," she said, blinking like she wasn't sure her eyes were telling the truth. I gave a small nod. "Hey, Rachel." She broke away from her group and walked over, her expression somewhere between surprise and hesitation. "Wow, it's really you. You look different." I smiled politely. "So do you." There was an awkward pause. She glanced at my name badge. "Solace Analytics. That's yours?" "Yeah, I run it." She looked impressed, maybe more than she intended to show. I could see it flicker behind her eyes, that recalibration people do when they realize they misjudged you. "I've heard of you guys," she said. "You built that predictive model for Newberry Capital, right, among others?" She laughed softly. "Guess you found your direction after all?" I shrugged. "Something like that." We talked for a few minutes. She told me she worked in property tech, now managing partnerships for a real estate SaaS platform based out of Seattle. She was in town for a few months consulting on a downtown rezoning project. She didn't mention a husband or boyfriend. I didn't ask. "You've really made something of yourself, Ethan," she said. Her tone was genuine, not patronizing. I didn't know what to say to that, so I took a sip of my drink and looked out over the crowd. "Remember that little apartment you had near Spear Boulevard?" she asked suddenly. The one with the broken radiator and the rooftop that leaked. Yeah, hard to forget. You used to sit up there with your laptop working on something all night. I never really understood what it was. Most people didn't. I'm glad you didn't give up. Neither of us spoke for a beat. Listen, she said, finally reaching into her bag. I'm not sure if this is weird, but here's my card. If you ever want to catch up properly, coffee or whatever. No pressure. I took it, slipped it into my jacket pocket without looking at it. She smiled softer this time. It was really good seeing you. She walked away before I could respond. I stayed another hour, though I don't remember much of what was said on the panels after that. My mind kept replaying that moment. Her face when she saw me. The way her voice shifted. The subtle regret maybe, or curiosity. Back in my apartment that night, I took the card out and placed it on the counter. I didn't call. Not yet. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. But I hadn't forgotten either. The cold way she left, the timing, the implication that I wasn't enough. Still, part of me wondered what she saw in me now, not the suit or the company name, but the man I had become in the years since she last looked at me like I mattered. The funny thing about being underestimated is that it sticks with you. Even after the wins, even after the numbers in the growth charts and the clients, that doubt lingers like a scar you've trained yourself to ignore. Rachel had been part of that scar, but she had also been part of the fuel. I didn't know yet if I wanted her back in my life, but the door once locked had been cracked open, and I was standing there staring through it, wondering what came next. The offer came in March 2022. It wasn't expected, at least not by me. We had just wrapped a successful fiscal year, closed 2 high-profile contracts, and were gearing up to expand our machine learning division. Everything felt steady, sustainable. I wasn't chasing an exit. But when the email from Stratwell Equity hit my inbox, I read it 3 times before calling my attorney. They had been watching us for over a year, they said. They liked our infrastructure, our lean model, our results. The offer was 18.4 million cash. No contingencies, no earnouts, full acquisition. I read the terms again at 3 a.m. In the dim light of my kitchen, the fridge humming behind me, a half-eaten bagel still on the counter. I wasn't sure if I should feel triumphant or terrified. After taxes, fees, and employee bonuses, my take-home was just over 15 million. I wired $1 million into long-term ETFs, split another into diversified real estate, and kept the rest in a portfolio that Walter would have nodded at. Balanced. Smart, quiet. I didn't upgrade my apartment. I didn't buy a new car. The Corolla still ran. The rent was reasonable. I had what I needed. I didn't tell my family. I thought about it once, drafted an email, deleted it. Thought about texting Derek just to see how fast he'd reply. I didn't. Instead, I kept my circle small. My team, my lawyer, my financial advisor. No press release, no announcement. Melissa knew, though. She had been a classmate back at UNC, now a journalist covering startup culture for a major tech publication. We had kept in loose contact over the years, usually through sporadic LinkedIn messages or the occasional comment on each other's posts. When she heard about the acquisition through one of her contacts, she emailed me. "You did it. I want to write your story. Full feature, your journey, your silence, your strategy. People need to hear it." I called her. We met for coffee at a quiet shop near Rhino, the same one I used to camp out in when Solace was just a deck and a dream. "You always stayed under the radar," she said, stirring oat milk into her Americano. "That's what makes this interesting. You didn't play the game and you still won." "It's not really a story," I replied. "That's exactly why it is," she said. She leaned forward. "You were working a grocery store job at 16, investing in your spare time, running simulations on a hand-me-down laptop. You built a multi-million-dollar company from scratch. Why wouldn't you want people to know that I didn't have an answer? Not one that made sense out loud. Walter used to say that some victories weren't meant to be paraded. They were meant to be lived. I'm not trying to be a role model, I said. I'm just moving forward. She nodded, but her eyes were disappointed. Okay, but if you change your mind, the offer stands. I thanked her, paid for both coffees, and walked out into the spring sunlight. That night, I opened a spreadsheet titled Personal. It had no formulas, no projections, just a list of things I used to want. I scrolled through it. Some were simple: a reliable car, a place to call my own. Some were bigger: financial freedom, peace of mind, self-worth. I closed the file without updating it. The truth was, nothing felt dramatically different. I didn't wake up with a new personality or a sudden hunger for yachts. I still bought groceries on Tuesdays. I still took long walks in the park after rain. I still used coupons. Maybe that was the biggest surprise of all. That the money didn't change me. It just made it easier to be exactly who I already was. But even as I settled into the new rhythm, I knew something was shifting. Not in my lifestyle, but in my story. People were starting to ask questions. Old acquaintances, distant relatives. Rachel texted once asking if I was free for dinner. I told her maybe another time. Melissa emailed again. Just one line. They'll find out eventually. Wouldn't you rather control the narrative? I didn't respond. Instead, I took a walk that evening past the old Solace office, now occupied by a vegan meal prep startup. I stood across the street and watched people go in and out carrying laptops, laughing into phones. They had no idea what had been built in those walls. And maybe that was the point. Quiet success has its own kind of power. The kind that doesn't need validation to exist. But something else stirred inside me. Not ego, not revenge, just readiness. For years I had built, waited, held back. Maybe it was time to let the story unfold, on my terms, in my own way. The voicemail came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, just after I stepped out of a meeting with my portfolio manager. I saw the missed call from Mom and let it go to voicemail, not out of malice, just instinct. She never called unless something was needed, and I wasn't in the headspace to field whatever that might be. When I got back to the apartment, I played the message while making tea. Hi, sweetheart, it's Mom. I hope you're doing well. We were thinking it'd be nice if you came home for Thanksgiving this year. It's been a while and the whole family will be there. Also, your brother and Lily are looking at a new place in Littleton, and I thought maybe you two could talk. You know, man to man, he could really use some support right now. Anyway, think about it. Let me know. I stood still, listening to it again. The way she said support, not advice, not guidance. Support. Derek needed help buying a house, and somehow that translated to me being summoned like a bank on wheels. I stared out the window, rain streaking down the glass, and weighed my options. I could ignore it, pretend I missed the call. But a strange curiosity bloomed inside me. Not about Derek's house or my mom's request, but about what it would feel like to walk back into that house knowing who I really was now. What I had built, what I had become. I texted her the next day. Sure, I'll come by. Let me know the time. She responded within minutes. Wonderful dinner's at 2. Bring whatever you'd like. Can't wait to see you. I booked the rental car, but decided not to drive the Tesla I had recently purchased through a holding company. Too flashy. Too obvious. Instead, I picked up a used Honda Civic from the lot near my place. It was clean, reliable, and boring. Perfect. The drive to Highlands Ranch felt longer than usual. The roads were dry, but the air was heavy with November stillness. Trees had already shed most of their leaves, and front yards were decorated with turkeys and orange lights. I turned down the street I had known since childhood and saw my parents' house still perfectly manicured like time had forgotten it. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest. Old habits. When I reached the porch, I heard her voice before I rang the bell. He's coming, but I'm not expecting much. He probably still does freelance stuff. Ethan was never really ambitious in the traditional sense. But he means well. I froze. The voice was hers unmistakably. She was talking to someone just beyond the front door. A neighbor, maybe. I heard the soft clink of coffee mugs and casual laughter. Freelance stuff. The words sat like cold stones in my stomach. I backed away, stepped off the porch without making a sound, and walked to the side of the house. I needed a moment to breathe, to let the sting pass before I could fake the right smile. I knew I shouldn't have been surprised, but hearing it still cracked something inside me. I had done everything alone. Built a company, sold it, invested wisely, stayed quiet, and still in her eyes I was the same boy who didn't measure up, the one who never quite shone the way Derek did. I gave myself 5 minutes. Then I walked back to the porch, rang the bell, and waited. She opened the door with that same familiar smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "There you are, come in, come in. Everyone's already in the kitchen." I stepped inside, wiping my feet out of habit. The house looked exactly the same, smelled the same too. Cinnamon, sage, and a hint of something fried. Derek was by the counter talking loudly about property taxes and down payments. Lily nodded along, holding a wine glass like it was an accessory. Ethan, Derek called out, "Didn't think you'd show, neither did I." He laughed like it was a joke. I placed the bottle of wine I brought on the counter and shook a few hands, accepted a few awkward hugs. My mom gestured toward the dining room. "Sit wherever you'd like, honey. I'm just finishing the sweet potatoes." I moved toward the window, keeping my back to the room. I didn't want to look at her yet, not after what I heard. Not until I could control whatever showed on my face. Freelance stuff. I didn't know why it got to me the way it did. Maybe because it reminded me of all the times I'd tried to explain myself over the years, and all the times I realized no one was really listening. Dinner hadn't even started, and already the weight of being here settled over me like fog. But I stayed. I smiled. I made small talk. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. The dining room buzzed with voices, clinking glasses, and the soft scrape of utensils against fine china that hadn't been used since last Thanksgiving. My mother always went all out for the holiday. Crystal water goblets, embroidered napkins, floral centerpiece shaped like a cornucopia. Tradition mattered more than comfort here. Derek and Lily were seated dead center, perfectly framed like the stars of a stage play. The spotlight, as always, was on them. Derek was animated, laughing louder than necessary, waving his fork around as he talked about the closing date for their new house in Littleton. It was a 3-bedroom with a finished basement, custom kitchen, smart thermostats. He mentioned the square footage twice and the school district 3 times. Everyone nodded, impressed. My aunt leaned over and said, "That's a wonderful area. Great investment." Lily blushed. "We've been saving for a while, but Derek's promotion made it possible. Timing just worked out." My uncle clapped him on the back. "That's what happens when you work hard and make smart choices." I sipped my water. Eventually, Derek glanced at me from across the table. His grin widened. "So, Ethan, you still doing, what was it again? That app thing?" I blinked. "App thing? You know, freelance development or whatever. Like contract gigs, right?" I set my fork down. "Not exactly." He raised an eyebrow. "So what are you up to these days?" Before I could answer, someone interrupted with a joke about turkey legs. The conversation turned. My reply dissolved before I could give it breath. Later, a cousin I barely recognized leaned toward me while spooning cranberry sauce. "I heard you're doing something in tech." I nodded. "I do a bit of personal investing now." He nodded vaguely, clearly uninterested, and moved on. The table fell into a lull as dessert arrived. Pumpkin pie pecan tartlets, something gluten-free for Lily's sister. My mom poured decaf into mugs and floated from guest to guest, glowing at compliments about the meal. Across from me, Derek leaned into Lily and whispered something that made her giggle. Then he looked up, caught my eye, and said a little louder than necessary, "You know, our realtor told us this new development is backed by some big data firm. She says it's what's making the neighborhood explode in value." "Pretty wild, huh?" I smiled just barely. "Yeah, I've heard good things about that one." No one caught the tone. No one caught the layer beneath. The truth was, the land Derek's new house sat on had been acquired by a development trust I invested in back in 2019. Solus Analytics provided the predictive data that led to the zoning shift. I hadn't been directly involved, but I knew the pipeline inside out. My name was on the silent partner agreement. They were buying into my legacy without even knowing it. I sat back in my chair, the hum of laughter and the warmth of roasted sweet potatoes fading into the background. I scanned the table, taking in every face. They still didn't see me. Not really. And that was fine, because soon they would. Derek wiped his mouth with his napkin, leaned back in his chair, and glanced at me like someone indulging a joke no one else got. "You know, Ethan, it's kind of incredible how you always manage to float around. No one really knows what you do, but here you are, like a Thanksgiving tradition." A few people chuckled softly, unsure if they were supposed to. He sipped his wine. "I mean, we all contribute, right? Lily's working full-time. I'm holding down 2 departments at the firm now. And you, well, you show up. That counts for something." I set my glass down, my fingers still around the stem. I looked directly at him, calm, steady. "Did your realtor mention who financed your new neighborhood development?" He frowned like the question didn't compute. "What? The subdivision? Willow Ridge? Did she say who funded the land acquisition and predictive zoning research?" Derek blinked. "I don't know. Some equity group." "Why?" "Because it's part of my investment portfolio." The room fell into a dense silence. Even the clink of cutlery stopped. My mother looked up from pouring gravy. Lily stared at her plate. Derek stared at me like I'd spoken in another language. I continued, voice quiet but firm. "I helped build the data models that drove the rezoning approval. Then I sold the technology. The startup. Last year. After taxes, I walked away with just over $15 million. You could have heard a fork drop." My aunt's mouth opened slightly, then closed. My uncle leaned back like someone just flipped a switch under his chair. Derek let out a soft, confused laugh. "You're messing with me." I shook my head once. "No, I'm not. Brandon." My cousin looked between us. "Wait, you sold your company?" I nodded. Mom cleared her throat. "I thought you were doing freelance apps or something. I used to. Then I built something bigger. Quietly." Derek was still frozen, processing. "You're telling me you own the land? I don't own it outright. I'm part of the investment trust that does. And I knew your name was on the offer sheet." He blinked rapidly. His knuckles went pale against his water glass. "Why didn't you say anything? Because no one asked." I stood up slowly, collecting my plate, then the one beside it. I didn't say it to boast. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I moved with the same calm I'd spent years building in solitude and silence. I carried the plates to the kitchen, feeling every eye follow me. No applause, no congratulations, just stunned slants, thick and palpable. I rinsed the dishes one by one under warm water. In the dining room, voices began again. Tentative. Awkward. I didn't return to the table right away. I didn't need to. They had seen me now, and that was enough. The clamor in the dining room died down, replaced by a heavy hush I could feel in my chest. My father pushed his chair back slowly. My mother cleared her throat. Derek stared at his mashed potatoes like they'd betrayed him. The truth was sitting between us, too big to ignore. My dad didn't meet my eyes. He folded his hands on the table in front of him, fingers interlaced tightly, brow furrowed. My mom tapped her spoon against her plate, then whispering that I was boasting. Boasting, she said, loud enough for a few people nearby to overhear. I sat quietly, breathing, listening. After a minute, someone asked if I wanted pie. I shook my head. My appetite was gone. The tension had flattened the sweetness in the room. I cleared my throat. I said I needed some air, slipped out onto the back porch. The wind was sharper in the evening, crisp with cold November. I looked up at the stars. The house lights behind me glowed softly. I carried something inside with me, not regret. Clarity. Later that evening, I met Melissa in a small cafe in Wash Park. It was raining lightly. Our table was by the window. She stirred tea. Steam curled up into the lamplit corners. She looked at me with something like concern and pride mixed. "Are you okay, Ethan?" she asked. I nodded. Then she asked quietly, "Did you plan for that moment earlier?" I said no. It was time. I told her then about the lawsuit, the apartment in Lakewood nearly 15 years earlier. How Mom and Dad had made me sign paperwork saying I was co-owner. How Derek had been listed as the primary tenant. How the lease was always under his name, bills in his name. How when rent escalated or remodeling happened, I never saw a penny despite the paperwork. How I told them. How they said it was just legal language. How I felt cheated. How I felt small but determined. Melissa listened without interrupting. When I said I had found old emails and the signed agreement in Walter's files, she leaned forward. Then the day I met with an attorney in 2021, filed the suit, the mediation, the hearing in Denver County Court. How the judge ruled in my favor, how I was granted 50% ownership rights plus financial compensation. How that decision had changed more inside me than all the wins. I saw tears in Melissa's eyes. Mine stung but did not fall, because in winning I had found something more important than money or recognition. I had found peace. We sat in silence for a long moment. Outside the cafe window, rain slid slowly down the glass. I took a sip of tea. I felt my heart settle. That night I returned home under a sky heavy with clouds. I walked through the front door. The living room lights were dim. Dishes still sat on the table. My mother was in the kitchen cleaning. My father in his chair reading the newspaper. Derek had vanished already. I caught my reflection in the mirror by the hallway. The person I saw was no longer invisible to me. And I did not need them to see me anymore, not for me to feel whole. I left the cafe feeling heavier than I expected, carrying a quiet sense of relief more than anything else. Over the next morning, I checked my email, mostly routine business correspondence, client updates, billing reminders. Then around noon, a message with Melissa Chang in the subject line blocked out the rest, drawing me in. It was a link to an online article with my face, the headline, "The Forgotten Son and Lessons in Family Finance." My stomach nodded. I clicked it and read. She had woven together my story from childhood through the lawsuit, the startup, the sale. She quoted me sparingly, let the facts speak. And readers responded. Comments poured in from people who said they saw themselves in me. A woman in Minnesota wrote about her older brother always being the golden child. A man in Texas thanked me for showing that someone could quietly build success without yelling it from rooftops. I skimmed through dozens more emails, some from strangers, some from old contacts. My phone buzzed with texts. Rachel asked if I had a moment that afternoon. She wrote, "See, it's not too late." I hesitated before replying, "Yes, definite." That afternoon, we met at a small bookstore cafe in Capitol Hill. She sat at a table by the window, sunlight leaning in across her face. She looked calmer than I remembered, less burdened by expectations. Her smile was kindly, and when she asked how I felt about the article, I told her truthfully that I was proud, more proud than scared. She nodded. "I'm glad you shared that part of yourself," she said quietly. "People needed to see it." Then she paused and looked out the window for a moment. I wondered if she saw Derek passing by or my name in headlines. Maybe she did. Rachel asked if I had ever considered returning home in a different way. Not for their approval, for mine. I thought about that while sipping tea, observing the dust motes dancing in the sun, the sound of pages turning at nearby tables. I told her maybe someday when it felt right. When I got home that evening, I sat at my desk. The house was quiet, my laptop was open. I read some of the responses to Melissa's article again. Gratitude, surprise, encouragement. It was more than I expected. I closed the laptop and stood. Walked over to the corner shelf where I had a framed photo of Grandpa Walter and me, from when I was about 6 years old, sitting on his front porch. His smile was gentle. His arm around me was firm. I reached up and touched the frame. I breathed in that old memory, the smell of grass, the sound of the wind through the trees, the way time felt endless then. A weight lifted inside me. I realized this was not about winning them over anymore. It was about honoring the part of me Grandpa always believed in. I needed nothing more tonight. The world outside could stay unaware for a while. I closed the lights in my office and looked out the window at the street lamps blinking on. I felt calm, whole, at peace. That spring, I drove up to Aspen with the keys to a place I hadn't seen in over 20 years. Grandpa Walter's cabin was still there, weathered by snow and sun, standing proud among the pines. The porch creaked the same way it used to under my tiny feet. The wind whistled through the same crooked chimney. It felt like time had waited. I walked the perimeter slowly, hand brushing the worn wooden railings. Memories flooded back, him pulling weeds in the garden, the scent of coffee in the mornings. His voice explaining inflation like it was a bedtime story. I had come to bring this place back, not just to life, but to purpose. I bought the house outright and filed permits to renovate it into something new. Not a second home or a trophy, but a community financial learning center. It would be a place for students, first-generation entrepreneurs, anyone lost in the maze of money and options, a safe place, a smart place, the kind he would have built himself if given the chance. Construction took months. I oversaw every detail. We kept the structure but expanded the back room into a classroom. I hung his portrait in the entryway. His old ledger stayed in a glass display. I called it the Walter Foundation. On opening day, the snow had just begun to melt. Students from Colorado State filed in. Volunteers from a local nonprofit helped organize the materials. I stood near the entrance, welcoming people, answering questions, watching the room swell with quiet energy. It was everything I had imagined. Rachel came. She sat in the back row wearing a navy coat and a soft smile. We hadn't spoken much since our last coffee, but her presence meant more than words. She listened as I told the group about compounding interest, about building credit, about never tying your worth to someone else's validation. They nodded, scribbled notes, asked questions I once hadn't known how to ask myself. As the last session ended, I stayed behind to stack chairs. She helped me without saying a word. When I thanked her, she just said, "You made something real." And I knew she meant more than the foundation. Weeks later, I received a letter from my mother. Short. She said she'd read Melissa's article. She hoped I was well. There was no apology, just a line about hoping I found what I was looking for. I folded it and put it in a drawer. I don't hate them. I don't need them. That's what changed. One Saturday afternoon, alone in the quiet of the center, I opened Grandpa's old investment notebook. I flipped to the last page. A line he had written there years ago stared up at me. Success isn't what they see. It's what you carry when no one's looking. I smiled. I got it now. Sometimes revenge isn't about making them hurt. It's about letting them see how well you lived anyway. And that's enough. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you're not enough, don't fight for a seat at their table. Build your own. Make it strong, make it kind, and fill it with people who see you. Live well. That's the best kind of ending. If this story moved you, hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories that remind you just how powerful growth and quiet strength can be.